Hey guys, I am back and I am going to try to start a new series. What? Will Ogden is going to start a new series? I give it about 3 weeks. And that would be an accurate thing to say. So hopefully this lasts for more than 3 weeks, which is about the period of time that I'm able to keep my focus on something, which is pretty good considering that I have mild ADD. Today is going to be the first episode of Sound Stories, episodes where I will be discussing a story about sound. These stories may have something to do with live sound, they could have something to do with recording, and it could even be DJing. It could be all over the place. Any experience I've ever had with sound is up for grabs on this Sound Stories related discussion. I may also be having Nick or Joe on this show, and maybe I will get some sound stories from them, or maybe even some stories behind the songs. To preface this story, I have to say that when I began audio, it was church. Church was audio for me. I started doing sound when I was in maybe 7th grade, and I learned a lot pretty quickly, and I would say I was up to par with the rest of the sound techs at the church maybe by the time I was in 9th or 10th grade. But around that time, I also joined the drama club at my high school, and I picked up some interesting habits from that weren't necessarily good habits to have. In fact, they were bad habits. And one of these habits was that I liked to listen to body microphones. I would listen into a body microphone, and I would be like, well, what are they saying? And when you're at a high school and there's like 30 people mic'd up and they're all having their side conversations off stage, you learn some interesting stuff. So one day I was at church and I was like, hey, I wonder what the pastor says when he's not preaching, right? And I mean, he didn't say anything particularly interesting. I think he commented on how he despised the coffee that the church had. And I found that I didn't think he was a particularly great singer. But then, of course, me being the interesting person I am, I decided at youth group, I'm going to share this with everybody. And basically, I got ratted out and I got kicked off the sound team for 6 months, right? So that was my first... Actually, my first and only sound-related punishment ever. But regardless of that, I learned my lesson. I don't do that anymore because that is not a professional thing to do. Now, that's not the story. That's all background. Now I'm going to get into the actual story. All of that is really important, though, to understand the story. During the time that I was not on the sound team, the sound team received significant funds from the rest of the church to upgrade our sound system. And unfortunately, I was not made part of the conversation in choosing said system, probably because of my age, which is unfortunate because I'm the only person on that team who is actively in the business of sound through DJing, so I actually know how to buy equipment. They don't. And one thing you'll find is production companies, or these companies that installation companies, they're not always good people. Specifically, churches and schools, they're excellent at scamming, because what they'll do is they'll come in and they'll give you the wrong system. And then when you decide it's bad, they'll say, oh, I guess you guys must be extraordinary people and need extra equipment. And then they'll charge you again to put something in that's better. Put something in that you should have had in the first place. So now let's talk about my church and specifically what decisions they made. So they had originally an analog mixing board. It was a Yamaha 32-channel analog mixing board. The speakers were all community speakers. There were 4 on each side. They're all behind like this kind of meshy stuff, and they were all angled all over the place so that they could really hit every portion of the sanctuary. There were also 2 dual 15 subwoofers in these little cabinets underneath either side of the stage. When they replaced it, they decided they needed to have a mono system. For those of whom who do not know what that means one speaker in the center. And there are definitely some advantages to this one speaker in the center format. The first one is that they're able to hide the projector behind it, so they don't need an enormous lens to throw the projector 75 feet. The second advantage is that there is no binaural crosstalk between the two speakers because there's only one. Now, what crosstalk is when you're, let's say, further to the left, and then you get some sound from the right at a slight delay to the one on the left because you're technically closer to the left. So specifically with spoken word, this creates a little bit more of that echoey sound and generally sounds worse. So a center speaker is superior for spoken word. The problem is a church is not a place where spoken word is the only format of media that is used. There's also music, right? There's worship. And worship is way better with stereo. It's a lot better. Like, it's not even close. It is very difficult to get a really nice wide sound stage without stereo speakers. When you have that one speaker in the center, it's almost always going to sound hollow, even if it's an excellent speaker. Another acoustic concept that we need to discuss is subwoofer placement. When you put subwoofers on the sides of the stage, you get something called what I call the flower petal pattern, which is essentially a pattern like this of amplitude. That means you and the person sitting next to you could be hearing completely different things in terms of bass. Whereas if you put the subwoofers next to each other, there will be a complete even circle around the subwoofers of amplitude, and thus everybody in the sanctuary will receive the same amount of bass. So, what exactly did they choose? For the speakers, they chose 3 QSC KLA line array speakers in an array right in the middle, 2 tiny itty-bitty little community, tiny little passive speakers in the corners, and then 2 QSC KW181 subwoofers mounted under the stage in the same place as those old Dual 15s. That's a pretty good setup. Those are good speakers. I've used the 181s. I've rented them before, and they're excellent speakers. I actually really like them. I have not had any experience with the KLA line array, but from what I've heard, they sound pretty good. So then I went to church, and it sounded horrible. And why did it sound horrible? Well, it sounded horrible because it was done wrong, because a church should have stereo speakers and subs in the middle. They had it backwards, and they could not figure out what was wrong with it. I will add that they also installed a new board, a Behringer X32, which is my favorite entry-level digital mixer. It's really easy to learn how to use, and it has a lot of advanced features that other boards do not have. So I was happy with that, and it took them a little while to learn how to use it. And by the time other people learned how to use it, I had come back on the sound team. And I found that it was really difficult to get a mix. So then I started looking into, like, how much did this stuff actually cost? A KLA 12 line array speaker is $2,000 a piece. So that line array was $6,000. The KW181s, I believe, cost somewhere around $1,500 a piece. So now we're up to about $9,000, right? And then the board is around $2,000. So around $11,000. But this is a installation company. Installation companies always charge more. They're charging more for the actual products themselves. They're going to upcharge you on cables. They're going to charge you $100 an hour for just consultation. They're going to charge you even more for installation. Every single part of that costs money. So when I had a discussion with one of the leaders, I suggested it would probably have been around $20,000, and he confirmed that that was true. It was about a $20,000 purchase, which is a lot of money. $20,000 is no joke. That is a lot of money, especially for a church, given that they can spend that money on absolutely anything. They can give that money to the poor. They can build new daycare rooms. They can anything. I mean, it's a church. Churches have so many other things that they need money for. So it's really important to be absolutely certain that you need to be spending that money that you're spending at a church. So why do I think this setup is so bad? Well, it's simply because of how much cheaper they could have done it for. This is what I would have told them if I was involved in the decision. I think that they made a really good decision with the X32, and I would have kept that in there. But the speakers, they did not make the right decision. Let me tell you what I would have done. I prefer the sound of a three-way speaker over a two-way speaker almost every time, assuming that they're both in the same, quality bracket, right? Those old gem sound speakers I used to have are three ways, but they sound like garbage because they're garbage speakers. But a JBL three-way, that's a different story. So what I would be going for is a pair of JBL three-way speakers, probably the SRX 835p or the PRX 835p, depending on coverage. I don't know if the SRX would actually be able to cover, simply because they have a smaller coverage area than the PRX do, because they're intended to be arrayed in boxes. But anyways, that would cost $3,000 for a pair of those, and they would be extremely easy to mount because they could just mount them where those existing speakers were, so they wouldn't even have to pay anybody to do that. Secondly, the subwoofer. I think I personally would have gone with the JBL SRX 828 SP because it integrates both drivers into one enclosure, so it forces you to keep it in the middle where it should be, and it's also $2,000. So you're saving $1,000 over the dual QSCs, and it's also louder and it sounds better. So, given that, I believe the total price comes out to $5,000, well, plus the board, which would be $7,000. So you're saving $4,000 at least, and then of course they had spent around $20,000 with all the consulting stuff. And if they had done this, it wouldn't have cost them anything. They would have saved $13,000 if they had done that. $13,000, and it would have sounded better. I would say very strongly, beware the sound installation companies. If you are looking to do a sound installation, you aren't sure what speakers you should get, you aren't sure what to do here, do not go to a sound installation company. Rather, find somebody who you know in your personal life who knows what they're talking about, or find somebody on the internet, find somebody on a forum, find someone who actually knows what they're doing, and get it figured out, and figure out exactly what you need. And talk to the people that are in your congregation and in your worship team. They're all going to have opinions on that, and they need to be heard because you're spending their money. That's money that they have donated to the church and could be spent on something more useful. So if you're considering a sound installation company, I would strongly recommend that you consider other options, or that you get somebody on board with you who can guide you through that process to make sure that the sound installation company is not going to scam you. Because these sound installation companies have real professionals at them, and they know what you need. But they're not always going to give you what they need because they want to make money, because they're a business, and sometimes they're a very greedy business, and that can overrun churches, which oftentimes, nowadays churches really aren't that greedy, right? Churches just have this idea that everybody is great and everybody's trying to help them, but they're not. These sound installation companies aren't trying to help you. They're trying to take your money. This has been Sound Stories number 1. Expect another at some point. There's a pretty good chance you're going to see some more of this stuff because I've got some more stories under my belt that I love to share with the internet.